you see him on the news.
CNN.com contributor, Dean Obeidallah. So, Dean...
Watch him at comedy clubs.
When I say Mecca, do you think of a holy place or an urban clothing line?
Read his articles, and you hear him on the radio. The Dean Obeidallah Show is on live right here on SiriusXM Progress, Channel 127.
And welcome to the show, brothers and sisters of the resistance, Wednesday, March 13th. And we are brothers and sisters. We are here for each other through good times and trying times and stressful times. That's what this brother and sisterhood's all about. I'm Dean Obeidallah. We're live Wednesday, March 13th, hoping to be your MBFF. And we got a lot to talk about. A lot of things to talk about. But first, some humor about the things we talked about last night. Here's Stephen Colbert on the college scandal. Quick joke on that, clip number one.
Huge scandal rocking the news cycle today, and it has to do with higher education, right? So Donald Trump is not involved. Sort of refreshing. Yeah. In a horrible way. You know how conspiracy theorists say everything is rigged for the wealthy and famous? Well, as a wealthy, famous person, let me just respond by saying, you're absolutely right.
The rich and famous run everything. And then a quick joke he did on Nancy Pelosi. He's got a really good theory. Nancy Pelosi, the idea of no impeachment of Trump. Here's Colbert's actual theory on what's up. Clip two.
She said in the interview, when it comes to the president, I'm not for impeachment. I don't think we should go down that path because it divides the country, and he's just not worth it. Okay, that's clearly reverse psychology. Nah, I am worth it, Nancy. For the good of our nation, you must impeach me now.
She's manipulating Trump. She's doing the rope-a-dope. Like Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. She's bringing him in, and down goes Foreman. Down goes Trump. We'll see how it all plays out there. I have no doubt if the evidence is presented that is credible, that shows Donald Trump should be impeached, they're going to have hearings in the House. They won't be able to stop it. We'll see how that works out. Tonight, though, I'll talk a little bit about Manafort. Then I want to get to an issue that I'm so intrigued by, and it's an issue that I've heard about for years, and finally it's being talked about in the terms of 2020, and that's reparations. So I'll talk about that in a minute, and we have two great guests later on. We'll tackle that and a bunch of other issues as well. But just to bring people up to speed on Paul Manafort, if you don't know, today he was sentenced to more jail time by a federal judge. He is sentenced now to a total of 7.5 years in prison. You remember when President Obama's campaign manager was sentenced to prison for bank fraud and tax fraud and witness intimidation, obstruction of justice? Remember that? No, me neither. Never happened. You see, Trump surrounds himself with criminals because that's who he feels most comfortable with, because he likes them and they share the same moral devoid compass. And that's what this is about, folks. And Trump said today, he said, I feel very badly for Paul Manafort. I feel badly for him. I think it's a very sad situation. He also literally said, and the judge said there was no collusion. This case had nothing to do with that, but Judge Amy Berman Jackson actually stated on the bench today that the idea of no collusion, said the no collusion mantra is also not accurate because the investigation is still ongoing. She literally said that on the record, and Trump just lied, and so did Manafort's lawyer, who came out afterwards and said, and the judge said no collusion. Who does he work for, Manafort or Trump? It seems like he works for Trump more. And then after this was all done, after Manafort was sentenced to 7.5 years in total, a couple hours later, he's indicted, Paul Manafort, here in New York by the New York District Attorney. And the latest indictment, the grand jury has indicted him on 16 counts of mortgage fraud, falsifying business records, and other crimes in connection with loans he sought. Here's the interesting part of all that, folks. Donald Trump can only pardon Paul Manafort as to federal crimes, not state crimes. So what they've done here with the Manhattan DA's office is make it very clear to Donald Trump, you can pardon Paul Manafort because you're a prisoner, you're a criminal yourself. And I think ultimately, I am not kidding, I think ultimately everyone who's convicted, if they're in prison, they're in Trump's orbit, if he loses in 2020, and I think he's going to lose badly, he will pardon all of them. So what they're doing now is, in New York, he's charged with state violations. And Trump cannot touch those. Now, for the legal eagles out there, you might be asking a question. Can Paul Manafort be charged in state court for crimes that are similar to the ones he was tried on? And that's a really great question, actually. There's a there's a legal safeguard called double jeopardy in our Constitution. You cannot be tried twice for the same offense. Generally, between state and federal law jurisdictions, you can be, unless they're really identical. There has to be, so it's a question that the lawyers are going to have to litigate, but depending on the facts and the particular laws in question, state and federal prosecutors can bring separate cases. So bottom line is there's no escaping for Paul Manafort. And I think for anyone, I think Roger Stone or anybody who gets convicted, I think you're going to see state actions brought right away. I mean, New York today, the district attorney made it very clear very quickly. They had a sealed indictment. They unsealed it today to make it clear to Manafort and to Trump, you're not going to let your friends out of jail free, the guys in your criminal gang and your criminal enterprise. So I want to talk about reparations, and I'd love to hear from you on this issue here. And I want to go through it a little bit. And we're going to have experts in the future. And I just chatted with Mark Thompson before, who gave me some great documents. He's involved in the National African American Reparations Commission. But I want to hear from listeners about what you want in terms of reparation if you're African American. But let's go through a little of the history for everyone, because it's a term that's been bandied about forever. And the genesis of the idea of reparations comes from slavery, obviously. And the idea that because of hundreds of years of slavery in this country, that our nation built its wealth through the labor of free labor of African Americans, Africans who were taken as slaves and brought here. At the time of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 by Lincoln, there was 3.9 million slaves approximately. Now, a lot of people have heard the term 40 acres and a mule, the idea of reparations. That's also Spike Lee's production company as he brings this up. That concept comes from General William Sherman. It was a special field order in January 1865. There was no mule in the first part, just so everyone knows. It was only at the time, he said, with this order, 400,000 acres of land, which was a strip of coastline from South Carolina to parts of Florida, including parts of Georgia, Sea Island, that would be redistributed to the newly freed slaves, and that each family would get a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable land. Later, Sherman then ordered and said the army can lend everyone a mule. So hence, 40 acres and a mule comes out of that. So what happened? Well, in reality, some free slaves did get the land, but in the fall of 1865, just 8-9 months later after Abraham Lincoln died, in comes Andrew Johnson, the new president, who is a racist, absolute racist, who is a sympathizer with the South, and he overturned it and took the land away from people who were actually living on it. Some of the freed slaves were making their life. He took them out. They were gone and gave it back to the former slave owners, the same people who declared war on the United States. So that ended reparations there. Obviously, through time, we don't have to go through it all, but we understand from Jim Crow to redlining to discrimination by state and by de facto went on against African Americans for years. And that's part of what reparations is about for people like the National African American Reparations Commission and for supporters of it, professors. It's about redressing, making amends for the wrongs of the past. And you might ask, well, what's the real world impact today of slavery? What if someone is a descendant of the 3.9 million slaves? Well, it's not a coincidence. We went through this on the show, did a whole special on income inequality, but also more importantly, wealth inequality. Income inequality is what you get paid now. Wealth inequality is the asset your family has developed over years. The median white household in America is 10 times wealthier than the median black one. And you might say, how does slavery or Jim Crow play into that? Because what is the number one way for wealth to be acquired in America? Anyone guess the number one way to acquire wealth? Through inheritance. So if you were a slave to the 1860s, you couldn't own property until 1863 at the very earliest. So first, you're behind the ball there, hundreds of years. Then secondly, with Jim Crow, people could not buy property. African Americans were discriminated against, and of course paid horrifically bad on the income side. So the question is, what would reparations look like? And this is the interesting thing. There's really no set answer. I'll read a little bit from a Duke University professor, William Darity, who is seen as one of the premier people on reparations. He's written about it. We're trying to get him on the show. In fact, in April, I think we might be able to get him, if not another professor is going to come on. He said there are 3 goals of reparations programs. The first is acknowledgement, that That's not a government program, but it's an acknowledgement by the government. Second is redress, which would be some kind of compensation. And third is closure. So two of them are much more intangible, but it's recognizing the wrongs of the United States government. It's recognizing the wrongs of the original Constitution, which had the fugitive slave clause in it, meaning that if a slave ran in the original Constitution, in black and white, it said the slave would have to be returned to the owner. It's the redress for Jim Crow. It's the redress for the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which was trying to keep the South from breaking away, and it was horrific. So it goes on, and Professor Dougherty, and this is not the be-all, this is just one example, and he's an expert on the area, said restitution, in his view, should be limited to those who can trace their roots back to at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. That was one big part of it. And he's argued that exclusively offering cash payments without addressing underlying structural problems doesn't do anything. You've got to underline it. He said, and I like this term, he calls for a portfolio of reparations, a combination of individual payments, targeted proposals like vouchers for financial asset building, free medical insurance, or free college education for African Americans, or at least a trust fund exclusively for Black Americans. The range is what this cost. It's all over the place because no one knows what's really going to be. 6 trillion, 2 trillion, 14 trillion. I see all these numbers. It doesn't matter now because we don't have a consensus what this should be. The reason I'm bringing it up is that up until now, no mainstream politician talked about it. President Obama did not talk about reparations. In fact, he said he was not in favor of it when he was last asked years and years ago. In 2016, both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders opposed reparations. A poll in 2016 found 68%, almost 70% of Americans oppose reparations. So that's a big, solid majority. Obviously, white overwhelmingly, Black people supported, but still it was never in polls of African Americans, it was never one of the top issues. And I just mentioned that to Mark Thompson. He was still here. And he said the reason I thought he was going to say, actually, that it was never seen as viable. So people didn't talk about it. It was not pushed for. But now in 2020, everything has changed. This is remarkable what's going on. We're having candidates one after the other asked about it. And I just want to go through a little bit about what each of the 2020 candidates. There's a great article in Vox yesterday that, excuse me, I had to drink some water, that went through each of the candidates. And I'm not praising or picking on any of them. I'm telling you what the reporting is objectively of each one. I'll play a clip of Bernie Sanders and Julian Castro talking about their views of it. Now, per Vox, Senator Kamala Harris said she expressed support for reparations in early February, but it's not clear about what she wants to do about it. And I get it, because this is a challenge. Like, how do you make amends? And whatever you articulate, if it doesn't go far enough, you're pissing off a great deal of people. If it's not well thought, if it's not thought through well enough, if it seemed like I'm just trying to pander without actually having a real policy. So she said, she talked about some specific things with the Griot publication. It's a great publication about, she said, if you look at the reality of who will benefit from certain policies, when you take into account they are not starting an equal footing, it will directly benefit Black children, Black families, Black homes, owners, because the disparities are so significant. And she's talked about a monthly payment to qualified citizens, but of any race. So there's a lot of these universal prescriptions for an issue that's not universal. And I'm not criticizing her. I'm just telling you what we're seeing right now. Senator Elizabeth Warren has said that she embraces the idea of reparations, but she also wants to include Native Americans in this discussion. And she has a proposal, the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. And that act would offer special financial aid to first-time homebuyers who were affected by redlining, which was a form of discrimination that classified predominantly Black communities and home buyers as hazardous and undesirable. So they were not allowed to buy, or they were impacted by the law, like actual law de jure, it's called discrimination against African Americans trying to buy. So on her level, it would be a little bit more specific to African Americans, but still, it's broad, it's universal. Senator Julian Castro, I'll play a clip of him. Here's clip number 5. He was responding to Jake Tapper just last week. And in this, he goes after Bernie Sanders a little bit, but that's not why I'm playing it. I'm playing it just to hear the most recent response of a candidate. Here's clip number 5 we'll go to.
What do you mean? Do you think that there should be actual monetary payments to descendants of slaves? Do you support more like what Senator Sanders is talking about, policies such as child care and education that help those who are disadvantaged?
Well, you know, what I said was that that I've long believed that this country should address slavery, the original sin of slavery, including by looking at reparations. And if I'm president, then I'm going to appoint a commission or task force to determine the best way to do that. There's a tremendous amount of disagreement on how we would do that. But let me just say something about Senator Sanders' response there, because he was also asked this question in 2016. What he said on The View, I think, the other day was that he didn't think the best way to address this was for the United States to write a check. To my mind, that may or may not be the best way to address it.
And then he goes on to slam Sanders, and I'm just saying, I mean, it's funny for him to say, maybe we'll write a check, maybe we shouldn't. I don't know what to do, but Senator Sanders doesn't want to write a check, and he slams him. But in any event, that's his response. And it's interesting, the commission idea is exactly, and as Mark was just highlighting, and I'm looking right now at the National African American Reparations Commission statement that just came out, saying that they encourage all the Democratic candidates to embrace H.R. 40 that was introduced to Congress in 1989, first time by John Conyers. And it actually would have a commission that would look at it, because no one has an easy answer. What reparations? There's a bunch of different competing ideas. So you had, that's Julian Castro. Here is Bernie Sanders on The Breakfast Club, which is, I think most people know, it's a famous syndicated radio show here. And he's talking to the host, Charlemagne the God, that's his name, I'm not giving it to him, about the idea of reparations. Here's clip number 3. This is recent. 3? No?
I think they mean some type of economic empowerment to the African descendants of slaves.
But what does that mean, economic empowerment? I just talked about the fact that I would do my best to change the banking system to make sure that we end racism, that we pay attention to distressed communities, that people get the loans they need to make the investments they need.
What about straight cash payouts?
No.
How much you want,
Sean? Agree with that? Why don't you agree with that?
Well, first of all, you mean just a check to every African American?
Yes.
Well, then there's a check to every Native American who were nearly wiped out when the settlers first came here. I think the way we go forward is to build America together. There are distressed communities, white communities, there are distressed Latino communities. Right now, what you have is a government owned and controlled by big money interests who worries about Wall Street and the drug companies. We're going to change that. And we're going to pay attention to the needs of working families and low-income families in this country in a way that you have never seen.
But this government has also systemically oppressed us in a way that they haven't oppressed other communities, through slavery, through segregation, now mass incarceration. And I think it should be something done specifically for African Americans.
So that was, the conversation continues sort of like in a circle there, but Charlemagne, and that's his name, made the point that there should be something specific, not universal. Everyone's prescription so far, everyone. I'm not picking on Bernie at all. Everyone's prescription is universal, not specific. And he said that will address the racial wealth gap, which is true. That will. Again, it's not reparations, but he's open to that. And so you've got this interesting thing where you've got, it's talked about. It's going to come up in the June debates, the first official DNC-sponsored debates. But the candidates are all over. They're grappling. They don't know what to do. And I'm looking at this great preliminary reparations program report by the National African American Reparations Commission. And certainly Mark Thompson, everyone involved in that, wants the candidates to look at that. Right now, though, they want them to embrace the idea of a commission. And I want to ask you, what do you want them to do? You're the grassroots. You're out there, especially if you're African American. What do you want them to do? And if you're a white progressive, are you on board with this? And if you're not, be honest. Tell us why. Because polling shows white people, and not just on the right, certainly in the center, are not on board with reparations for African Americans. So is there a way to frame it where you get more support and it becomes something that should be done? In my heart, something should be done. Slavery was enforced by the United States Constitution. This was not by just society. This was in the written document by the framers of the Constitution. We talk about everything the framers have done that's great, and they have done some great things. But they did protect slavery in the original Constitution. There should be compensation for that. That's a wrong, and that's not 2,000 years ago. It's a few hundred years ago, and we continue to have slavery enforced by state and federal law. Federal law, 1850, they passed a new federal law, the Fugitive Slave Act, that was draconian. So you're talking about laws just 100 and something years ago that were still by law enforcing slavery in this country. There should be compensation. I don't know. It's not my community. I want to know what you think. What do you want from the government? And I also want to know, especially from African Americans, is this an issue that ranks up there for you? Or are there other issues that are much more important? This would be great to address, but there's other things like healthcare or climate change or income inequality, whatever it might be, that are more concerning to you. Because we're going to hear a lot more about this. And later in the show, we'll talk about a lot of issues, but I've got Jamira Burley and then Aisha Moody Mills on. Both African-American, and we're going to talk about a bunch of issues, but this is certainly the first one I'll talk about with both of them from their point of view. Jamira's a millennial. Aisha's a little older. I don't know what age. She looks great for her age. I don't know how old she is, but obviously Jamira's a different generation than myself and Aisha. So I want to hear from her, especially, do millennials talk about this at all? Is reparations an issue to millennials who are African-American or not at all? So 866-997-4748. You're my guest right to the top, and we'll continue the conversation even when they're here if you're still on hold, because I'd love to hear from more people about this. We'll be right back after this on the Dean Obeidallah Show. At this point, the question is not who connected to Donald Trump as a criminal. The question is any